Imagine you're 32 years old, a 10-year NBA veteran coming off 2 NBA championships.
The Chicago Bulls have won the NBA championship for the second straight season.
And the winner of the three-point contest in each of the last 3 years.
Craig Hodges has won his third three-point shootout title in a row.
And sure, you're not moving as well as you used to, but you can spot up and hit the long-range shot better than anyone. Most likely there'd be an NBA team that would want those services, or at least give you a tryout. But for Craig Hodges, that wasn't the case, as after a decade as a model professional and lights-out shooter, he couldn't even get a team to call him back. But as this video will try to outline, it wasn't because he was obsolete as a player. It was because he was outspoken about racial and social injustice at a time where the NBA didn't want players making waves, even though his sacrifices at that time blazed the trail for the NBA to become one of the most progressive professional associations in modern-day sports. And when you look at what he did on and off the court, it's not a stretch to say Craig Hodges is one of the most influential athletes in history, yet seemingly vanished from the league overnight.
And Craig Hodges is probably a bigger factor than a lot of people think.
But to understand why his sudden and confusing departure from the NBA occurred, we need to understand how passionate he was about making a change and how effective he was as a player. Let's jog your memory. Spending his childhood in Chicago Heights, Craig Hodges grew up during the height of the civil rights movement of the 60s.
Where I grew up at Lincoln Highway and Fifth Avenue is considered the term during the 60s was it was the crossroads of the nation.
And while slight change was beginning to occur, he would say that it was still the tail end of Jim Crow, as there were still rules that black people were expected to follow. And although it didn't ensure their safety, they would walk in packs to try and be more protected. But Craig Hodges was born into a family who was very active in the civil rights movement.
I had those primary role models in my life. My mom was the secretary for the Civil Rights Organization. My granddad was part of the union organizing during the 60s. So,
where Hodges learned about the injustices and developed his worldview firsthand.
And to be able to sit there and listen and see real life leadership, not something that was kind of coached upon you or something that was taught to you, but something that you grew up as part of your childhood. And that, that part of my life was as important as, playing baseball.
And even though his family was so active in the movement, Hodges would also say that they did their best to shield him from the racism. Hodges' first sport was baseball, as according to him, his grandfather told him that being a catcher was the quickest path to the professional level. So he spent a decade of his childhood doing exactly that, before getting more serious about basketball in high school, as he would say that he was a scared, skinny kid, but he spent his summer going into his junior year practicing catching and shooting the ball.
After that summer, my uncle told me that all he wanted me to was just to catch and shoot the ball. I was doing a lot off the dribble, and that's where I honed in my shooting skills a lot more.
Hodges would attend Long Beach State, where he would be coached by Hall of Famer Tex Winter. Originally, Winter had been recruiting Hodges to go to Northwestern, where he was coaching at the time. But Hodges wanted to get away from the cold Chicago winters. So when Tex Winter was hired at Long Beach State during Hodges' senior year of high school, Hodges would take him up on his still standing offer to play college ball for him. And while this would further Hodges' on-court career, he would also say that this period of his life was invaluable due to the learning opportunities that he had, as well as who he got to learn from, as these teachings would not only help him further understand the conditions of black people, but also how members of other cultures could help enact changes. Hodges' time at Long Beach State saw improvement from him, yet regression from the team, as Hodges would average double-figure scoring in each of his 4 seasons, while routinely being one of the team's best distributors and pickpockets. And by his senior year, he was top 5 in the PCAA in scoring, assists, and steals, as he would be named first team all-conference. However, Hodges had just 1 season with the team recording more than 16 wins, with his senior year being their worst, when they finished 12-16. But in a stroke of luck, Hodges would explain that during his senior year, San Diego Clippers head coach Paul Silas came to a game to recruit a player on the other team.
And that was probably one of my best shooting nights of my career. I was 13 for 13, had 26 points, not knowing that Paul Silas was watching from the top, who was the coach for the San Diego Clippers. And he said when he saw me shoot the basketball without dribbling it, he said he wanted me on his team.
After a good pre-draft camp performance, Hodges was selected in the 3rd round, 48th overall by the San Diego Clippers. And as he would say,
and I got a chance to play for Donald Sterling, of all people.
But after a veteran Bill Walton told Hodges to stay away from management,
I'm like, all right, cool, I'm a rookie, you Bill Walton, you know better than me. So it was almost a thing to me when I saw management, I went the other way.
So Hodges wouldn't have too many interactions with the now disgraced former owner of the Clippers. But on the court, the Clippers were one of the league's worst teams, yet featured a young forward duo made up of the second-year Tom Chambers and fellow rookie Terry Cummings, as these two would be the focal points of the team. But Hodges was on a minimum deal, and there was no guarantee he would remain on the team. But he made sure that he played so well, the Clippers wouldn't get rid of him, as even though Hodges would develop a reputation as more of a standstill catch-and-shoot guy during his later years, a young Craig Hodges was a solid all-around offensive player. He was a shooting guard by position, but at 6'2", he wasn't a stranger to point guard. So throughout the season, he would shuffle between the starting lineup and a high minutes bench player, while splitting time between shooting guard and point guard, and starting 48 out of his 76 games played, with a lot of these starts being a result of point guard Lionel Hollins missing 26 games. And Hodges would produce, with his great mid-range game and quickness off the dribble, averaging nearly 10 points, while also finishing second on the team in assists, and even recording a career-high 12 dimes to go along with 13 points in a December 7th loss to Golden State. However, the Clippers were still one of the league's worst teams, finishing the year at 25-57 and missing the playoffs, as Hodges' rookie season ended with him averaging about 10 points, 3.5 assists, and 1 steal per game. The Clippers had a more stable point guard situation in '84, with the offseason acquisition of Norm Nixon, who would play and start in every game, and they would add second-year shooting guard Ricky Pierce through a trade with Detroit, as these two acquisitions affected Hodges' playing time, as he would see his numbers drop across the board. And even though he began as a starter and was putting up improved numbers over his first 14 games of the year, this wouldn't last long, as he would only get 14 more starts over the rest of the season, with probably the biggest reason for his decrease in playing time being that Silas was no longer the Clippers coach, as he had been replaced with Jim Lynam. But even though Chambers was gone, the Clippers were top 10 in points per game, yet would again feature one of the league's worst defenses, and would finish at just 30-52, and again miss the playoffs, as Hodges averaged about 8 points, 1.5 assists, and a steal per game. But the Clippers were set to move to LA, yet Hodges wouldn't be going with them. Shortly before the '85 season, a big trade between the Clippers and the Bucks saw Hodges included in a package to Milwaukee, along with Cummings and Pierce, in what would become a steal for the Bucks. And as Hodges would say, Milwaukee could have pulled off a trade earlier for Cummings and Pierce, but Bucks coach Don Nelson held off.
He was like, I could have made the deal to get Terry and Ricky Pierce a couple years ago, but I wanted to make sure I got you in the deal because I think you're going to have a long career.
So now these three young guys were joining a Bucks team with the great defensive duo of guards Sidney Moncrief and forward Paul Pressey. And initially Hodges was coming off the bench, but a freak back injury to point guard Mike Dunleavy led to Moncrief being shifted to point guard and Hodges being promoted to the starting shooting guard. And with this larger role, Hodges turned in one of the best years of his career, averaging double-figure scoring for the first time and dishing a career-high 4.3 assists. And he really started to show how great of a shooter he was, as he went 49% from the field and nearly 35% from deep, as his shooting ability made up for the loss of Dunleavy. And because of this, the Bucks didn't miss a beat, as they would score over 5 more points per game while allowing the least points in the league for the second straight season, and overall finishing with a 59-23 record and getting a first-round matchup with the Chicago Bulls. Hodges' playoff debut didn't go as well as he would have liked, as during this series against the Bulls, he had just one game shooting over 43% and would make just one of his 11 three-pointers, while also often finding himself in foul trouble. But the Bucks were still the better team, as they would wrap up the series in 4 games to move on to a semifinals matchup with Philadelphia. Hodges started game 1 by playing 38 minutes and dropping 13 points, yet the Bucks lost in a blowout. Then over the next 3, Hodges would have just one more game in double figures, yet overall played another underwhelming series. And this time the Bucks would lose in a sweep, as Hodges' first year in Milwaukee had seen him average about 10.5 points, 4.5 assists, and a steal per game. The Bucks looked the same in 1986. Their big three of Cummings, Moncrief, and Pressey were still leading the team, while Pierce acted as one of the league's top 6 men. And then there was Hodges, still starting in the backcourt and quietly giving the Bucks very efficient scoring, while also acting as one of the league's first great long-range specialists. Hodges would attempt 162 three-pointers this year, which was the 6th most in the NBA, but his 73 makes was the 2nd most, as he was draining over 45% of his three-pointers, making him the most efficient deep ball shooter in the league. And with the NBA debuting a three-point shooting contest at All-Star Weekend this season, Hodges was a perfect candidate for the inaugural event. In Hodges' first ever round, he finished with a record 25 out of a possible 30 points.
Craig Hodges from the Milwaukee Bucks, a surprise, I'm sure, to the fans here. 25 points in the first round, a terrific...
And eventually made it all the way to the final, to take on Boston's Larry Bird. But Hodges managed just 12 points in the final, as Bird's 22 would give him the crown. But Hodges would be back, as the three-point shootout at All-Star Weekend would become his second home for the rest of his career. Back in the association, the Bucks were 33-18 coming out of the break, and with a top 5 offense and defense, they would go 57-25 on the year, and would get a first-round matchup with New Jersey. Hodges came out on fire, as in Game 1 he went for 25 points on 10 of 11 shooting in a win. Then although he scored a combined 13 points over the next 2, the Bucks still swept the Nets, setting up a second-round rematch with Philly. The first 3 games saw Hodges average about 11 points, yet he was making his shots count, as he was hitting 52% of them. But the Bucks were down 2-1, and then Hodges turned it up the rest of the way, as he went for 13 in a Game 4 win, then 10 in a Game 5 win. Then even though the Bucks couldn't close it out in Game 6, Hodges still went for 22 points, while hitting 5 three-pointers and also racking up a playoff career-high 8 steals. Then in a winner-go-home Game 7, Hodges went for 24 points on 9 of 16 shooting, and would be credited with the game-winning shot after his last-second attempt was goaltended, as the Bucks won and advanced to a conference finals matchup with Boston. Overall, Hodges played a respectable series, averaging about 13 points and 4.5 assists, while making 6 of 11 threes. But the Celtics were just too much, as they ran through the Bucks in an easy sweep, with Hodges' year ending with him averaging about 11 points, 3.5 assists, and a steal per game. For the most part, Hodges would keep his same role for the 87 season, but the Bucks would see a lot of lineup change outside of this, as they had brought in veteran center Jack Sikma prior to the season, and knee issues would end up limiting Moncrief to just 39 games, as the Bucks would bring in point guard John Lucas to fill in. So Hodges would appear in 78 games, as he was a starter for his first 43, and was putting up solid numbers, yet was lacking some of the efficiency that he had last year. However, he was still a premier deep ball shooter, finishing top 5 in the league with 85 made threes, as he would make his second appearance at the three-point shootout. But this year he wouldn't make it out of the first round, after losing a tiebreaker. But coming out of All-Star Weekend, Hodges, who had recently started coming off the bench, rejoined a Bucks team sitting at a solid 29-21. And even with the injuries, they would turn in another 50-win season, as they finished the year at 50-32 and got a first-round matchup with the Sixers. Hodges would really see his minutes dip in the playoffs, as he was still coming off the bench, and over the first 4 games, he was averaging about 8 points on less than 20 minutes a night. But the Bucks took a 3-1 lead, and then with Game 5 remaining close for the first 3 quarters, Hodges exploded in the 4th quarter, as he scored all 14 of his points in the final frame to help blow the game open.
Hodges, 14 in this final period, has broken it open for Milwaukee off the bench,
and give the Bucks the win, which gave them the series, and advanced them to a second-round matchup with Boston. Hodges' best game of this series came in Game 4, when he had 13 points on 5 of 6 shooting. But the Bucks lost the game and fell behind 3-1. They would fight back to force a Game 7, but Hodges was an afterthought in this game, as he received just 8 minutes and went scoreless in a loss, as his season ended with him averaging about 11 points, 3 assists, and a steal per game. Come the 1988 season, Nelson was gone, and the Bucks' new coach was Del Harris. And under Harris, Hodges was seeing the court even less, as his time as a starter had come to an end, and his minutes were the lowest they had been since his second year with the Clippers. And although he was seeing a drop in his numbers, he was still exceptionally productive in his limited minutes, and continued as one of the league's best three-point shooters, making his 3rd consecutive appearance in the three-point shootout. But again, Hodges would fail to make it out of the first round, scoring just 10 points. But soon after the break, and right before the trade deadline, Hodges was shipped away. The Phoenix Suns were trying to change their image after their drug scandal, so they would send Jay Humphries to the Bucks for Hodges. And Hodges would join a Suns team sitting at 15-34. And after spending a couple weeks on injured reserve, he eventually made his debut in early March, appearing in 23 games off the bench while shooting lights out from beyond the arc in that time, which helped him finish with the league's top three-point percentage for the second time in 3 years, with a career high and then NBA record 49.1%. But the Suns won just 13 games after the trade, and their 28-54 record wasn't enough for the playoffs, as Hodges' year ended with him averaging about 9.5 points, 2.5 assists, and half a steal per game. The following season began with Hodges as a member of the Suns, as his first 10 games of the year would be played in a Suns uniform. And although Phoenix was a team on the rise, Hodges was getting less than 10 minutes per game. But then Suns GM Jerry Colangelo presented Hodges with a trade offer that he couldn't refuse.
And I'm like, what you talking about, Jerry? He's like, yeah, I can send you to Chicago if you want to go. I'm like, brother, come on, man, give me that ticket so I can go home.
So Hodges was back home, suiting up for the Chicago Bulls. But his days as a starter would be over, as he wasn't going to overtake Chicago's fifth-year superstar Michael Jordan, as along with him, the Bulls also featured a young Scottie Pippen and Horace Grant. And most importantly for Hodges, he got to reunite with his college coach, as Tex Winter was an assistant under head coach Doug Collins. And while Hodges wasn't going to give the Bulls a lot on the stat sheet, just having him on the court made things much easier for Jordan, as you couldn't leave Hodges alone on the perimeter. So Jordan's path to layups and dunks were made just a little easier. Hodges spent the rest of the year in Chicago primarily as a bench player, and at this stage of his career, you really saw him transition into the NBA's first true specialist from beyond the arc, with nearly 42% of his shots coming from three-point range. And as usual, he was at All-Star Weekend competing for the three-point crown, and after 2 disappointing performances, he had one of his best outings in '89, finishing as runner-up to champion Dale Ellis. Chicago came out of the All-Star break sitting at 27-20 and would win 20 more after that, to finish at 47-35. And Hodges had also been made the starting point guard near the end of the year, as he would put up great numbers in his 6 games as a starter, and the Bulls would win 5 of their final 7. So the Bulls were in the playoffs, and Hodges was still a starter for the first-round matchup with Cleveland. And while his overall shooting wasn't great, he would still shoot over 42% from deep, while also dishing nearly 4 assists. And Hodges would have 3 games scoring in double figures, with each of those games resulting in a win. And Jordan's shot to give the Bulls the Game 5 win would push them through to a second-round matchup with New York. Hodges kicked off round 2 with one of his best playoff games, going for 24 points on 10 of 18 shooting, as the Bulls took Game 1. Then he would score double figures in both of his next 2, as Chicago went up 2-1. He struggled over his next 2, with 7 combined points on 2 of 14 shooting. But with an opportunity to wrap up the series in Game 6, Hodges dropped 15 points on over 54% shooting, while dishing 6 assists, as Chicago got the win and moved on to a conference finals matchup with Detroit. The first 3 games saw Hodges average about 7.5 points, yet struggled to find his shot, but Jordan would will the team to a 2-1 lead in that time. Yet after this, the Jordan rules really kicked in, as the Pistons made life terrible for Jordan every time he came near the hoop. And with Pippen fading away as the series went on, the Bulls needed scoring from somewhere, and Hodges would become that secondary threat, as over the next 3 games, he was the team's second leading scorer, behind Jordan, averaging nearly 17 points on over 51% shooting, while draining 12 three-pointers. However, Detroit would win all 3, as they eliminated Chicago in 6, and Hodges' year had ended with him averaging about 9 points, 2.5 assists, and half a steal per game. Hodges would be in a permanent bench role for the 1990 season, as John Paxson would have a career year, and rookie point guard BJ Armstrong would also cut into Hodges' minutes. Hodges would appear in 63 games and would start none of them, for a Bulls team now coached by Phil Jackson. And while Hodges was playing a more minimal role on the court, he was thinking of a much bigger picture off the court. As with Jordan's initial deal with Nike coming to an end, Hodges went to Jordan and tried to sell him on the idea of starting his own shoe brand. And while years later MJ would start Jordan Brand, Hodges' idea was completely different, as he wanted Jordan to capitalize on his popularity and use that to create a shoe brand that exclusively employs members of the Black community, to provide them with permanent jobs so they wouldn't have to turn to other means to provide for their families. And Hodges wasn't just pitching an idea, he had every intention of working with Jordan to get this off the ground. But Jordan wasn't sold on the idea, choosing to re-sign with Nike. But while Hodges hadn't been successful in his attempted endeavor, on the court, he continued as one of the league's top deep ball threats. As even in his limited minutes, while missing 19 games, he was top 20 in the NBA in made three-pointers, while shooting a career-high 3.4 per game, and finishing with the league's second-best three-point percentage. And the first three-point contest of the 90s would finally see Hodges take the throne. Hodges would defeat his Chicago teammate in the first round, as Michael Jordan couldn't keep up with the three-point marksman. Then eventually Hodges would make his return to the final round, this year taking on Reggie Miller. But in his fifth straight three-point contest, Hodges was a seasoned veteran, and got a little bit of luck, as Miller missed his final attempt, which would have won it for him, as Hodges finally captured the three-point shooting crown. The Bulls were 28-19 coming out of All-Star break, but really picked it up over the rest of the season, winning 27 of their final 35 to finish with a 55-27 record, and enter the first round of the playoffs with a matchup against Hodges' former team. Hodges wasn't getting a ton of minutes throughout these playoffs, as he had missed over a month near the end of the season with a back strain and still wasn't 100%. So their first round series with Milwaukee saw Hodges average about 4.5 points in about 12.5 minutes a night, yet Chicago won in a gentleman's sweep. A second round matchup with the Sixers was much of the same for Hodges, getting about 14 minutes a night while averaging about 3.5 points, as his recovering back was hindering his effectiveness, making less than 37% of his shots this series. Yet another gentleman's sweep had the Bulls returning to the conference finals for a rematch with the defending champion Pistons. Jordan was again doing everything for the Bulls, and for most of the series, Scottie Pippen was looking more prepared for the physicality. And although Hodges' minutes had seen another slight increase, he had completely lost his shooting touch, averaging 2 points over the first 5 games on a combined 4 of 19 from the field, and the Bulls were down 3-2. But facing elimination in Game 6, Hodges came out firing, as after a Paxson sprained ankle forced Hodges into a bigger role, he would drop 19 points on 7 of 9 shooting while making all 4 of his three-point attempts, as the Bulls won in a blowout. Then with Paxson unable to go in Game 7, Hodges got the start, yet shot just 3 of 13 from the field, as Detroit won it easily, to again eliminate Chicago, with Hodges' season ending with him averaging about 6.5 points, 1.5 assists, and half a steal per game. But the following season would finally see the Bulls break through. Jordan continued as the team's star, winning his second MVP this year. But now Scottie Pippen was looking like a true number 2 in year 4. Hodges had been left behind in the rotation, with Paxson and Armstrong being the more used guards outside of Jordan. So although Hodges' 73 games was the most he had played in since his final year in Milwaukee, he was seeing the court for less than 12 minutes a night in those games. And with Hodges having less time to get in a groove, and also moving slower at 30 years old, and coming off a back strain, his three-point percentage would drop below 40% for the first time in 4 years. Yet 38.3% was still very good, as overall Hodges would hit double figures in just 7 games this season. But he would have moments, such as going for a season-high 20 points on 8 of 11 shooting in a November 24th defeat of Denver. And when All-Star Weekend rolled around, Hodges was back to defend his crown. After advancing through the quarterfinals, Hodges looked like he wasn't going to miss to start the semifinal round.
Waiting for this. 12 in a row. 13. Unbelievable. He hasn't missed yet.
As he set a record by making his first 19 shots, before ultimately finishing with a score of 24, as he advanced to the final, eventually winning to repeat as three-point champ, and then return to a dominant Bulls team sitting at 32-14 in the early stages of what would become an 11-game win streak, as overall they would finish at 61-21 and get a first-round matchup with New York. And a blowout Game 1 win allowed Hodges to get extended minutes, as he put up 16 points. Then with the next 2 games being closer, Hodges had a smaller role, but the Bulls won both to sweep and advance to a second-round matchup with Philadelphia. Hodges would again get limited minutes off the bench, averaging about 4 points, with the majority of those points coming from beyond the arc, as he shot better than 45% from deep. And for the 3rd straight year, they would meet Detroit in the conference finals. But the Bulls had figured out the Pistons, as they wouldn't just beat them, they would embarrass them in a convincing 4-game sweep, which saw Hodges average about 5 points, and Chicago finally break through to the finals to take on a Magic Johnson-led Lakers team. And while this was exciting, Hodges saw this as an opportunity to bring attention to the current underrepresentation of black people in ownership and management roles in the NBA. According to Hodges, prior to Game 1 of the finals, he approached Jordan and Magic to suggest both teams sitting out the game to protest this underrepresentation, and Hodges felt that if the league's two biggest stars spearheaded this, then the league would have to not only listen, but also commit to making a change. With Hodges using the 1964 NBA All-Star Game boycott, which led to the formation of the NBA Players Union, and gave the players a voice that they had never had before, as an example of what could come from this protest. But once again, Hodges did not get the result he was hoping for, as both Jordan and Magic refused to go forward with this request, with Hodges again referring to the financial incentive or potential for future positions being the reason that some of the stars of the league were apprehensive about speaking out.
Or was it because you could see a certain amount of energy coming at you that could affect your bottom line, could affect you moving into upper management, could affect you.
So the finals moved forward as planned, with the Bulls dropping Game 1 in Chicago, but then winning the next 4. And even though Hodges again had a small role in this series, he still played in every game and was just as much of a champion as everyone else on the Bulls, as his season ended with him averaging about 5 points, 1.5 assists, and half a steal per game. But with the Bulls set to attend the White House in October for winning the championship, Hodges again saw an opportunity, this time to bring the country's issues of racial injustice directly to the president himself.
Dramatic videotape obtained by Channel 5 News shows what appears to be a group of LAPD officers beating a suspect.
Less than 6 months earlier, the police beating of Rodney King had occurred, with the acquittal of these officers being the event that preceded the LA riots in the spring of 1992. So Hodges saw the visit to the White House likely a lot differently than the rest of his teammates. And interestingly, Jordan would not attend this visit, instead choosing to play golf. But Hodges was there, and while his teammates were wearing suits, he was wearing a dashiki, prompting the president's son and future president himself to speak to Hodges as if he didn't understand English. Hodges was being polite and respectful throughout, even taking a few shots with President George H.W. Bush watching. But later on in the visit, when the cameras were off, Hodges handed a letter to one of the assistants of the president, detailing the discrimination in America and what could be done to help with the major issue. But this would change everything for Hodges and his career, as it had many looking at him differently and wondering why he would do something like this, which went against the grain and rubbed people the wrong way. And while from the outside looking in, this was out of character for an NBA player who was just expected to play his role on the court, this was completely within Hodges' character.
And so when we look at some of the moves I made, whether it's going to the White House, whether wearing a dashiki to the White House, or some of the stance that I've taken, it was not out of character. You know what I'm saying? It was how I was taught, it was how I was raised. And a lot of people wasn't raised the way I was.
Only this time it was televised for everyone to see. And his decision to write a letter was also nothing new for him, as it was something he had been doing his whole life. And growing up in the home he did, it was completely normal to take action and fight for civil rights. Yet Hodges would never receive a response from the president, and is still unsure if the letter was even read by him. But for now, Hodges was still a member of the Bulls, who were set to begin their title defense a few weeks after this White House visit. Jordan and Pippen were one of the league's premier duos, but Hodges, who was now in his 10th year, would have a year to forget, as after playing in the team's first 2 games, he would undergo knee surgery and be sidelined for a month and a half. Yet he would appear in most of the team's remaining games. And when All-Star Weekend came around in February, he was on a quest to three-peat as three-point champion. And again, Hodges was in the final round, and although he had a less than ideal 16 points, Jim Les would miss his final shot, which would have won it for him, as Hodges joined Larry Bird as the only players to not only win the contest 3 times, but to win it 3 times in a row. Then Hodges came back to a Bulls team that was steamrolling the league, with a top 5 offense and top 3 defense, as they would finish with a league-best 67-15 record, and would get a first-round playoff matchup with Miami. Hodges would have a small role throughout the playoffs, averaging less than 3 points in a first-round sweep. Then in a 7-game series win over New York in the second round, Hodges would hit at least 2 3-pointers in each of the final 3 games. As Chicago advanced to the conference finals to take on Cleveland, Hodges would play in the first 5 games before sustaining an injury that kept him out of Game 6, which the Bulls won to advance to the NBA Finals to take on Portland, and Hodges' injury would keep him out for the first 3 games, before he would briefly return in Games 4 and 5, then sit out Game 6, as the Bulls wrapped it up in 6, to repeat as champions, with Hodges' year ending with him averaging 4.5 points, 1 assist, and half a steal per game. But about a month after their win, the Bulls would waive Hodges, but he didn't expect this to be his final time on an NBA roster. From the Bulls' perspective, it made sense to move on from Hodges. He was coming off an injury-filled year, and the team's guard rotation was already established, with Paxson, Armstrong, and the newly signed Trent Tucker. And during the finals, Hodges had also publicly criticized Jordan for not using his platform to speak out about the LA riots, which likely didn't help his case to stay. But while the biggest concern was Hodges' mobility and what he offered outside of his 3-point shooting, with one team official being brutally honest about his defensive effectiveness, he was still one of, if not the best 3-point shooter in the league, and had been the Players Association rep for every team he played for. And while the Bulls would be just fine without him, you'd think at least one other team would have use for him. And even if no one decided to add him to their roster, at the very least, you would think a 10-year vet like Hodges would get a chance. As when no team called the free agent Hodges, him and his agent tried calling every team, but couldn't even secure him a tryout. And Phil Jackson would also say that it was puzzling and unusual that they didn't receive a single call inquiring about Hodges after placing him on waivers. So Hodges would spend the 93 season as an NBA free agent, and when the 3-point shootout came along, he originally was left off of the participant list due to not being on a team, but eventually would be allowed to compete, marking his 8th straight appearance. Yet his reign as 3-point king would come to an end after losing in the semis, and Hodges would never play on an NBA court again, as he would bounce around a few professional teams over the next few years, even spending time as both a player in the CBA and coach for Chicago State University at the same time in the mid-90s. But during this period, he was compiling evidence to file a lawsuit, as in late December of 1996, Hodges alleged that the owners and operators of the NBA franchises had participated as co-conspirators in blackballing him from the league due to his outspoken political nature, with him specifically drawing on his 1991 visit to the White House as an incident that embarrassed the NBA, and Hodges' association with Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam being harmful to the image of the league, therefore leading to the NBA disassociating themselves with Hodges. And while Cavs GM Wayne Embry expressed doubt around this accusation, and Commissioner David Stern denied it outright, there were other guys, like then head of the Players Association Buck Williams, who acknowledged the threat of repercussions for the black athlete when speaking out on sensitive issues. And Hodges' lawsuit also alleged that in 1992, the Supersonics director of player personnel expressed interest in bringing him in, but quickly backed away, as he was also black and allegedly felt that this could have a negative effect on his own job. But Craig Hodges would never have another role as a player in the NBA, and his coaching career at Chicago State ended shortly after he filed his lawsuit. But nearly a decade later, an LA Lakers team featuring a prime Kobe Bryant had rehired Phil Jackson as head coach, who had brought in Tex Winter. And as Winter had gave Hodges an opportunity at Long Beach State nearly 30 years earlier, he again pleaded for Hodges to be added to the coaching staff. And he would be, as Hodges spent the next 6 seasons as an assistant with the team, helping players improve their shooting and winning 2 more titles in that time. Yet shockingly, being the one member of the organization who did not get to attend either White House visit with President Barack Obama in office.
I was the only person in the entire organization. They took 2 planes, man. They took 2 planes, and I didn't get to go.
As Hodges would eventually leave the team in 2011. But Hodges has not taken a break from his involvement in the fight for social justice and equal rights, and would even publish a book in 2017 detailing his journey as an NBA freedom fighter. And in the years following, the NBA became more and more socially aware and progressive, this time spearheaded by their best players standing for a cause, which likely wouldn't have been possible if not for the sacrifices made decades earlier by guys like Hodges and Mahmoud Abdul-Rauf. So Craig Hodges saw his career end abruptly and it's easy to say that he was a player on his last legs and wouldn't have made a team anyway. And while that's a legitimate truth, it's the fact that he didn't even get a call, even though there were some teams who may have had interest. As a player, Craig Hodges doesn't get enough credit for being the first three-point specialist in a time where the three-pointer was a shot that wasn't encouraged. So in that way, he was a trailblazer for a type of player that has essentially become mandatory in today's NBA. But that's pennies compared to the trailblazer that he is due to his work off the court as a civil rights activist from his earliest years. He wasn't afraid to speak up and was always respectful. And he was smart about it, knowing that if he could convince the best players in the league to take a stand, then it would have a much bigger impact than a player of his status. Yet when that didn't work, he took matters into his own hands, which may have very well been the nail in the coffin for his NBA career. So at first glance, Craig Hodges has statistics that look average and an off-court story that the NBA has only recently started acknowledging. But when you really dissect his career and life story, Craig Hodges is one of the most influential basketball players and overall athletes in history. But that's it for today's episode on Craig Hodges. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Bucks and Clippers teammates, or this one on another player who stood up for a cause he believed in. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.